Please welcome writer-director Noah Baumbach.
Thank you.
Welcome to Santa Barbara, Noah.
Thanks for having me.
This film, when I've seen it a couple of times now, it plays at times like a thriller. It plays at other times like a legal drama. There is romance and screwball comedy moments, and we have musical numbers. When you were writing, is that something that you were aware, that the shifting of genres?
I became aware of it. I wasn't aware of. I didn't start writing it thinking I would have those opportunities, but I did find as I was working on it in the material that there were all these, as you're saying, kind of embedded genres in it, and it was partly my job to kind of be open to them and not be afraid of it. And it was something that in shooting it we thought about too, in terms of how we wanted to shoot the movie, that we could, that certain scenes could have kind of screwball elements to them, people going in and out of doors, when she's going to serve him the papers. That is, like, on one hand, a kind of like comic, it was like an opportunity for a kind of comic set piece, but knowing at the same time that envelope is also like a bomb under a table, that the protagonist, or one of our protagonists doesn't know about, and the audience does, and that creates anxiety. I mean, that's like a great thriller setup as well. So those kinds of those opportunities, sort of afforded themselves to me as I was working on it.
There's I think that the average person that watches a film gets so involved with the story, but there has been so much design behind this film that I greatly admire. The fact that the color coding that you do for LA and New York City, can you tell us about the work with your production designer? In New York City, we have red bricks. In LA, it turns to gray palm trees, etc.
Right. Well, that was something that we would, Jade Healy was the production designer, Mark Bridges, the costume designer, Robbie Ryan, the cinematographer, and then I would involve Jen Lame, my editor, as well in these. We would get together early on in prep, and we would talk about all these sort of different elements, and palette, of course, is a big part of that, and how is sort of almost like who's going to provide the color, who's providing. It's like you're having a potluck, and it's like, okay, well, whose job is it in this scene to bring the red? Well, that'll be Mark. Mark will put that in the wardrobe, so we won't have it in the walls, or we won't have it in the. And so we're all kind of know how we're putting this painting of sorts together. But in those discussions, there were just early discussions of, like, does the palette change when we go to LA from New York? Should it be different? And what we came upon very quickly was that it should be the same, knowing that it's going to shift dramatically because the environments are so different and the light is so different in Los Angeles and in California versus New York. So red in California, the same shirt is going to look different in both places. But as you say, the red brick of New York versus the sort of Spanish tile of LA, just the same blue sky looks entirely different from one place to the other. So it was, and then those things go into character. It was the thing of Charlie. Charlie, in a sense, is catching up throughout the movie. Nicole is kind of there at the beginning. She is the momentum at the beginning, which is causing, she's also in the most pain early on for those reasons. And Charlie is sort of catching up, and we thought about that in terms of his wardrobe. It's like when he comes to Los Angeles, he's wearing sweat layers. He's wearing sweater and an overcoat, and that it's like he's still dressing for yesterday. That he hasn't gotten there yet.
You mentioned white walls, and there is watching the film. There's so many spaces that they are transitioning in. We're at a rental office, we're at a legal office, we're in a waiting area. There's so much airports, there's so much white, but is it me noticing that the whites, you make them different and interesting?
Yeah, well, we knew, you're right, there's a whole portion of the movie it is transitional spaces, and we start in home and a kind of, a kind of traditional notion of home, which is where you live with your family and you have your child, and it's all the personality that's in those, that opening montage sequence and these little moments, and everything is lived in, and it's got history, and then knowing that we were going to then be thrust into these spaces you're talking about, which are, these offices and that they're by design impersonal. They're set up to have no personality, or to be inoffensive, which of course I think creates its own kind of sense of menace in this way. When it can, depending on the reasons you're there or not. It's like being in a waiting room somewhere. You can be can feel like the worst place in the world, even though it's the same People magazine that you might have at home. And so we did. We thought a lot about these whites, and also about the color that, what do the individuals bring into these spaces. And of course that's then taken to another level when Charlie is trying to make his kind of impersonal LA apartment feel like a home, and what does that mean? Plants and rugs and frame, it's this kind of, again, this sort of notion of home was something we talked about a lot, because of course that idea and that notion changes as the movie changes, as things go forward. Where is home? And home becomes, is in one sense represented by New York and LA, and then the lawyers turn it into these sort of arguments, but of course it's something else too, and that's kind of one of the things I always felt the movie was about.
You used, and I hope you don't mind me asking you all this geeky questions, but you mentioned the threat in those scenes with the white walls, and you shoot them in low angles and wide. Can you which does give us a sense of threat? Can you tell us about that choice?
Yeah, absolutely. The geeky questions are the best questions.
Okay, well, don't encourage me too much, because we're going to go down a rabbit hole.
Let's go down the rabbit hole. We can all fit. Let's go. Yes. Well, the other thing is that we're always in the perspective of Charlie or Nicole, or both of them, because they're one or the other is in every scene. So in a lot of these scenes too, we're always over one. If it's Charlie and Ray Liotta's character, we're always over Charlie's shoulder. We're never over Ray's. So it's always Charlie's perspective of what's happening, and often, he's sitting too. So we often thought about, that sort of low perspective of feeling kind of, that there's something kind of aggressive and overwhelming about these experiences in these places, and then later when Charlie and Nicole are, say, in the mediation at Nora's conference room, or when they're at in the courtroom, we're still always with Charlie and Nicole. Even when the lawyers talk, we're with them. So we're always staying in their perspective, which I think also it makes it more subjective in that way. It's designed to be invisible, but I think it always keeps you with them. And that, I think, also adds to what you're saying, this sort of sense of menace, too, because it's their experience of these places. For the lawyers, they go to these places all the time. This is their workplace. It's not, they're not going to have that experience. So so that was something we did very specifically. We looked at, sort of, references. Like we looked at Dr. Strangelove because I thought, that movie has so many people at tables and it's a comedy, but it also has this sort of surreal, menacing quality to it, and how they were shot, and that the sort of sort of in the war room, you have the kind of wide and that sort of strange stage that it feels like at times, and these kind of like really kind of arch angles, and so we thought about that a bit, particularly in the courtroom and sequences with Ray Liotta's character, because he's he could be in that war room, I feel like, in Dr. Strangelove.
You mentioned Dr. Strangelove, and I told you outside one of my favorite filmmakers is Ingmar Bergman, and you pay homage. Well, you don't pay homage. You're influenced in this film by Bergman. The way you frame the faces. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Robbie and I looked a lot at Persona, Bergman's great, one of his masterpieces. He's got a few, and really a lot for the framing and for the faces. And that movie has amazing close-ups, but it also has amazing, just the way they shoot people in space together, and which I knew was going to be sort of a big part of this movie when we were going into it. And there's also this notion of internal and external. It was something we thought a lot about, which of course relates to the space. The rooms. We're in these rooms, and you see the space outside Los Angeles it's almost like a painting. Outside those rooms, like you can't quite get to it because you're in some kind of spaceship. It feels like at times. But then the internal and external, the emotional and psychological, and those two actors do so much in their faces, and they have amazing faces. They've got great movie faces on a very simple level, and then they also convey such life. And there's things, there are looks that they give, and we would shoot them in these close-ups for the whole scene. So you'd have all the lawyers would be playing everything out and talking, and we'd be just on their faces, and they would just live it the whole time. I'd look at the dailies. I'd think you could play the whole scene just on this one take, because it's everything, Persona again was a very inspiring for both. The audacity too. There's shots in that movie where you can't believe it, like just the way the faces overlap, and it's so strong and so gutsy. He even fuses their faces, at one point, that famous image, and then he lets the film burn. That movie is both. I don't know that I even understand it, but I go to it often because I think it's got everything in it at the same time. You had mentioned earlier about the invisibility of your hand at times, but I want to talk about the Charlie's breakdown that has a very emotional impact on us that feels very naturalistic, but that sequence is highly constructed. Can you talk about that approach? Yeah. Well, that scene was, we rehearsed the whole movie before we shot, and we rehearsed nearly every scene. We would go to the location and rehearse in the location, but we knew for that one. I think it was like an 11-page scene, and we shot it for 2 days, and it's a 10-minute sequence in the movie. So first it was about getting the language, just everybody familiar, like that. The language is a lot of it. Where they overlap, all those things are in the script, and so getting them just comfortable with it and the rhythm and the pace, and it's almost like a warm-up. Then we would go into the space itself again before we've started shooting, and we blocked everything out. So every movement is, we have it all down. The script supervisor has it all, and we have everything kind of planned out. And then as well, I had with Jen, my editor, we had the close-ups, because there's a series of close-ups where we get closer and closer so till their faces really take over the whole screen. And I knew on what line and what piece of a word I wanted to cut on. But I always wanted to be physical as well as verbal. So I had them, I would give them sort of motions. So I'd say like, okay, but say it, but turn into it, or lunge forward, or sit down. So I knew I could then cut on these moments. So everything, in the sense, was very technically blocked out. With their, it was all things that they could feel comfortable within. If they didn't feel like, oh, I don't want to stand on this line, we wouldn't do it. We would find another way into it. But they're both so good that they're kind of they can find a kind of immediacy and truth in whatever you give them, in a way. So then when we're shooting the thing, we shot with one camera, and we're kind of ready. And I feel like then it gives them, it's almost like, think of almost like blocking out an action sequence. It's like they have all the sort of safe space, everything is taken care of, that they can just be and just do it and just let go. And they did. And they brought so much of themselves to the whole movie, but that sequence in particular, really took a lot out of them. I mean, it was exhausting. It was exhausting, that whole 2 days, and we'd have to take breaks, and it was the hardest thing, the most difficult thing I've had to do as a director, but also the most rewarding for the same reasons. And
then you had to go and edit those scenes, and did it relive the emotion?
It was it's a lot of footage, and also because that scene is very much about momentum as well. So it's difficult for them. Like, it'd be hard to say, let's just pick up on this line in the middle while you're shouting. They would go back and have to redo the scene to get to the moment that we knew we needed, or we wanted to pick it up at. So there was a lot of runway at every time too, which again was just exhausting. So then when we're looking at the material, we're watching we watch every take, and there were 2 days of multiple takes of long sequences, because that scene is also shot, at least parts of it are shot in long takes, and they're walking around. So that was also exhausting for us to go through it again. And that continued. The mix of the movie, we would have to stop too, because it was so it's just a lot. But again, that so gratifying, because it was so. It was exciting. There's catharsis in that scene too. I mean, I think part of the blocking of that scene. What made it, I think, intuitive for the actors is that we discovered that it, in a way, mirrored their kind of relationship for a lot of the movie. Charlie is not really confronting what's happening, and she is, and she's kind of going forward, trying to get him to focus, and he keeps finding things. He's going to do a dish right now. He's going to go into Henry's room and make sure his backpack is ready for school, or whatever he's got, and it's when he finally comes forward, you feel the cost. You understand why he's been, that he's been defending himself, and not, and that is what happens in that scene. And as painful as it is, it's also necessary, I think, for him. I mean, it didn't necessarily, the things that go on in that scene didn't have to happen, but it did. And given that it did, I mean, this goes to what I was saying earlier. I think one way of looking at it is the movie is about her building herself up and finding a voice, refinding a voice, and his story is kind of about breaking himself down.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of finding their voice and relating to movement, you have two moments: the Nicole's monologue, and you have Adam being alive. The camera moves completely different in those two sequences. They're not moving for logical, action-oriented movement. The camera is observing in a completely different way. Can you tell us about that choice?
Yeah, well, that's the only time the camera, those two sequences are the only time the camera moves on its own accord, I mean, or seemingly on its own accord. The camera always moves a lot in the movie because people move a lot in the movie, but it's always motivated by a physical action. In that sequence, I felt that there was kind of emotional movement. There was psychological and emotional shift, like something was changing in the person, and that the camera couldn't help but move in, like like our own rules break because of what they're doing. And I find that exciting as a director, is being open to these opportunities that is, sometimes you miss them. You go home and you're like, oh, you look at the dailies, when you're editing and you're like, I didn't do this right. I didn't catch that, but I love that in movies where the rules you have, the sort of, and the rules sometimes are conscious, sometimes they're intuitive, of how, when the camera can move, when it can't, when music comes, there are so many of these things of, camera angles, color, but when those rules can break, and when they break for you, and when you do see them, when you're open to them, it's exciting to take advantage of those opportunities. And that's where I felt like, it's like, and I have the feeling it's almost like when a character changes internally. This goes to the internal external. When a character changes internally, it gives the kind of cinema of the movie. The filmmaking itself also can shift, and that's something, again, that should be invisible in some sense for the viewer, but make an intuitive sense, feel right to you. And I love that. I love that kind of thing in movies, particularly when I get it right, but so often you get it wrong.
Speaking of changing the rules, Randy Newman, and you mentioned music, we're used to seeing in movies where the score underscores what is happening. In this case, the score is reacting to what is happening on the screen. Can you tell us about that choice?
Yeah, we felt like, well, the score in a sense also begins, it's your introduction to the movie. Actually, the score is such a big part of that. It's in these two montages in the beginning. And I felt like something that he and I talked about early on was that we wanted it to be compassionate, not sentimental, but compassionate, loving to these people, celebratory, because of their. And in the beginning, it's all that because of their marriage and what they love about each other, and it's it's like those little moments trigger the music, and the music's reacting, as you say, to those moments. But when this music returns, and variations of it play in the rest of in other parts of the movie, it suddenly has different meaning because things have shifted. And I always love when music. We talked a lot about Georges Delerue, the French composer who did a lot of Truffaut movies and Godard movies, and how that music could play in scenes like the music from Contempt, the Godard movie, it's a kind of chilly movie, Contempt. But the score is so emotional, and it plays in these scenes, and it just feels so. It's a total contrast between the way the music plays and what the scene is, and I feel like that's something I wanted the music to be flexible in that way, because in some ways it's always playing the compassion, even when things are hard and people are behaving, they're not their best selves, or they're not, and that it's still there for them in a way, and it's sort of acknowledging their best self in some sense. And in that way too, I always saw it as that the movie, as you said, not underscoring it, but kind of, it's almost brought forth from the movie when something happens. It has to return. It's like, I'm here. And when it plays again at the end, and we're also hearing the words from the opening of the movie again in a new context, and hearing them aloud for the first time, that it could play as the audience's musical memory as well. That now they have that, and music can do that. It can bring those moments back visually, in a sense, and so there's a way, in some ways, too, for the audience to have the memory too, not just the characters.
Speaking of returning, or I'm here, I'm coming back, the opening, the first time we see Nicole, the shot of her coming from underneath the subway, she's coming from the earth up. How was that intentional? How did you come up with that shot?
Well, I came up with that shot because I live in New York, and I come out of the subway a lot, and it's something I've done since I was a kid, and I don't know, at some point I thought, like, just that sort of rising up, it both was just so ordinary and so familiar to me, but I thought, well, I'd love to see that in a movie, that feeling of coming up, and of course you take it then and put it in a new context, it sort of has other it could have other meaning. You could bring meaning to it. But I wasn't thinking about it in any kind of, like, with actual meaning. It really was just thinking about sort of the ordinary, day to day, the things that go by kind of, unnoticed in our lives unless somebody points them out to us, or, and what's lovely is when you feel seen by someone who loves you, and they're are pointing those things out, and it can even be kind of like embarrassing, but it's it's like I didn't realize I thought I was getting away with that, or you're not, but because they see you, and but also just those day-to-day moments, those things that we do all the time, and those visuals that we another one I thought about was like the driving in LA with a child, is those points of view. You have so many conversations, with a child in the back seat, but you're always just watching the road, so there's all these conversations that are almost kind of disembodied while you're just driving, and they're just watching the back of your head, or they're staring out the window or playing with something, and so I always had the angles of the, that from when Charlie's driving, or we're from the back of his head looking, and sort of we're always like just watching the road, and but again, those things that are kind of habitual, that that if you find the right moments in movies to put them in and bring those visuals in, it's can provide both comfort and humor maybe, but also in a bigger picture, maybe have some significance.
And we've talked about Bergman, we've talked about Kubrick, now Stephen Sondheim. You give both of them a song from Company. You can drive a person crazy, and Being Alive. Why that choice?
Well, that came from Adam, and I have been talking about Company for a while, and even toyed with the idea of, like, would there be a movie of Company? What would that be like? And in those conversations, I was saying, like, well, you should sing Being Alive just in something, even if we don't do this. Like, we should find And I've joked about this, that I reverse engineered the whole movie just to get Adam to sing "Being Alive," which it's even only partially a joke. But I did have that note throughout. I've had that note, and if it hadn't made it into this one, I would have kicked it on to the next one and tried to get him to sing it in something else. But in doing that, and of course because they are in the theater, there was real opportunity in that, and I wanted the song. I mean, you had compared it to Nicole's monologue earlier. I mean, I do see those, even though she has her song too. I think it's her monologue and Being Alive that are probably more kind of companion scenes in a sense. But I wanted it to have the to serve the same purposes that songs do in great musicals, where the character is changes from the beginning of the song to the end, that the song provides story and character and insight and emotion, and as well as entertainment. And so that so that was what we found there, is that we gave us that opportunity. And of course when he does it, I mean it's amazing. I mean, you know, it's Adam. I mean, it's just, and we wanted it to be that, you know, he would, you know, that he knows the musical so well that he would do all the little bits, you know, also just the voices and add those, and we did that at this place, the Knickerbocker in New York, which is sort of like in one of those sort of those old village places, and that has music, and it's the same place they're at in the beginning too, when they're after their play, and we shot it, and you know, all the theater company was off camera and there, and it was just, it had a kind of one of those great kind of, it's, you know, kind of great day at work, because you know, we're just on a slow dolly just going in, and Adam sings, you know, 12 takes of Being Alive all in one, you know, going back and forth to the table, and you know, he just had that kind of amazing, you know, you don't always get those chills that maybe you get in a movie when you're shooting the movie. Often you don't. It's the opposite. But you maybe get conscious chill. You're like, that'll work, or that'll be good, but you're not actually getting it there. In this movie, I had more of those than, as I said, I had it with the fight scene, and I certainly had it with her monologue, I had it with his thing, where I felt like I was watching their movie, like they've taken me out of myself.
We do need to talk about Laura Dern, and we've never seen her be this incredibly good, and what makes it so good is that we never know what her real intentions are. You know, can you tell us about working with her and developing the character in that way?
Yeah, and we did develop it together. I mean, I talked to her a lot about it as I, you know, before I wrote it, and you know, and there are things when you know you have Laura Dern writing a line like, you know, Nora, you know, sort of sachets across the room, and you know, and says, "Sorry, I look so schleppy. I had an event at my kid's school." Like, you know, that's a great introduction, and suddenly it's a good line, because it's Laura. Because Laura walking across that room is like fantastic, you know. But it's on the page, it's just, you know, it's whatever. I mean, it's fine, but it's not that, and that's knowing you have Laura. And I felt that the lawyers, you know, I kind of looked at the lawyers as professionals, and that they were, they know how to work in this system, and this is how they do it, and they become a necessary part of this process if you go through it. And what I love is that we never really had a conversation about it, but Laura knew, like, she never comments, she just plays it, and it's riveting because of that, I think, because you don't know. And people can have many different thoughts about it or different thoughts at different times. And it's also why I wanted to give her the monologue that she has too, because I mean, something that I think that monologue came from talking to Laura and her talking about, like, saying something like, I'll bet when she first got into this, she had more altruistic intentions, thing before you learn the politics of the whole thing, that there is that sense of wanting to defend, and people and women, in this, going through this process, and that was something. And I thought, well, then what would be something she could say that would kind of bring that back? Again, in the context of the movie, and it's Laura, you don't know, is this more, when she's telling Charlie what a genius he is and how much she loved his play, and it's so confusing.
You don't know if she's is a strategy to get to him, or she's actually being kind to him.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
Well, no, I am being given the hook to wrap it up for the past 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun. Yeah.
Incredible film.